Thanks for joining, everyone. Today's webinar, No Device Left Behind, is being brought to you by Arista and TWE Solutions. Today, joining me, I'm John Marcato from TWE, one of the co-founders, and with me is Rudy Araujo, who is the VP of Security Product Strategy at Arista, and we're going to be covering NDR, Network Detection and Response. Arista is a leader in this space, and we've had a lot of success together talking about this with people and bringing them this solution. And as is sort of indicated from the title, one of the great things about NDR is that it solves a really common modern security problem. It really solves multiple, and Rudy's going to go into some depth on that, but at a very high level, just to frame the problem, essentially there are a lot of devices that are communicating on the network, and some of those maybe can take an antivirus or EDR type agent, but so many critical devices can't. And the other thing is that there's just a lot of different tools that are often required to understand what's happening both north, south, and east, west on a network. NDR takes a unique and very modern approach to solving this problem of being able to understand what all the communication is and the relationships between that data. And I think it's fair to say, Rudy, that that was just not a problem that could be solved in the same way many years ago before the advent of modern sort of ML and AI type technologies. So with that, I just want to make one little public announcement before we give a quick intro here, which is at the end of the webinar, we will leave time to fill out a survey, and that survey is really important for us to make sure that our future webinars are super interesting, and also to find out what you thought about the content of this webinar. If you do fill it out, we will send you an amazing Yeti Arista mug. They are so great, and you definitely want one. So hopefully you can stay around and fill that out. It's brief, just a few questions, but it would be really helpful to us. So TWE Solutions is a provider of value-added resale and MSP solutions for the modern enterprise. And so we've worked with Arista for about 10 years and have had a lot of success in solving problems with Arista and many other great products as well, but Arista is certainly our largest, and we really love what they bring to the table. I think I'm not probably saying something too controversial there, as it's become the products that I think are really leading the marketplace. But with that, Rudy, I didn't know if you want to give any further introduction, but I think if you want to jump in and then maybe frame the problem more deeply, I think it'd be great to hand it off to you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
All right. You know, I'm always a little bit paranoid about these webinars that some audio glitch is going to kick in. But anyways, that's great. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time. And John and TWE, thanks so much for hosting us, right? I mean, it's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about what we do and what we're seeing out there, right? But I did want to segue real quickly off what you touched on. You know, what is that problem statement, right? Like, there's so many different technologies in security. There's so many buzzwords and things like that. And one of the things I hear from customers all the time is, hey, how do we know what we really need? Like, what is the problem statement that, you know, we can hope to address with this type of solution or the other type of solution, etc. And what I'd like to tell you is just a couple of things that I hear from customers pretty consistently, right? And it's usually the conversations that they initiate when they reach out to us and say, look, we've got this problem, and this is what we think you can help with. That first problem is really what you touched on, which is the idea that there's a number of devices on the network. In fact, our research shows that it's upwards of 50%, sometimes even 60 or 70% of the devices on the network are unmanaged, right? And this is everything from your BYOD type devices, your contractors coming in and out, all of the IoT devices like the thermostat, the TVs in the conference room, the voice over IP phones, you know, the stuff that's frankly sometimes hiding in plain sight, right? You can't put your EDR agents on it. You can't pull logs from it into a SIEM or an SCCM type setup. And so customers really struggle to understand what is my attack surface, right? That's usually the way they might describe the problem. How do I get a better sense for what my attack surface? So that's kind of one aspect of the problem, right? And that's from a defensive posture perspective. Now you can also look at this problem from an offensive posture, which is what are the attackers doing, right? So the attackers are targeting all of those devices, but increasingly they're targeting those devices without relying on malware. So historically, if you look at the last 20 years, malware was a thing, right? I came from FireEye, for instance, where we made a living by creating anti-malware solutions. If you're using EDR solutions, if you're using, even back in the antivirus days, it was all about malware. And I think all of that focus has actually made us as an industry more effective at detecting malware. And so the attackers have realized that malware, while it's still useful, is not as useful as it used to be. And so they've evolved. They're smart people, right? So they've evolved where now, increasingly, if you look at breaches, right? And this stat came from CrowdStrike, but I think FireEye has a similar stat. I should say Trellix now has a similar stat as well, that in all the breaches that they respond to, the majority of the breaches, there are no traces of malware. Now, it's not to say that malware has gone away, but what the attackers are doing now is they're leveraging what these so-called living of the land techniques, right? Which is using the tools that are already deployed in your environment, using the applications that are already deployed. Think about PowerShell, for instance, being used as an exploitation tool. So the challenge for the defender now is how do you find that one PowerShell instance that is behaving maliciously from potentially the thousands of other PowerShell instances that are just your IT folks doing what they normally do, right? So that's another big challenge that customers struggle with. And to your point, John, this is where the ability to crunch large amounts of data and find the needle, frankly, in a haystack of needles, it becomes really critical. And certainly technologies like machine learning and AI have a role to play there. But we'll get into the mechanics of it in a little bit. I always like to start with a case study, right? Like kind of the show me the money slide, if you will. What can you do? And look, ransomware is one of those things that is really, being challenging to customers, right? And in this particular case, this customer was dealing with a ransomware threat. And actually, in parallel, completely coincidentally, we were running a proof of concept for this customer in their Dallas office. So a couple of weeks into this proof of concept, we see this activity coming out of their Atlanta office, which is a bunch of PowerShell connections attempting to enumerate file shares on the network using the SMB protocol, attempting to download additional content off the internet from somewhat legitimate sites, like Pastebin, right? So the sites that can be used maliciously, but are not necessarily always malicious. Even using things like Box.com and Dropbox as vectors to kind of download their additional content or upload content. And so what we were able to do was essentially identify this as the early warning signs of a ransomware attack, right? Because we were seeing the types of things that ransomware attackers do, because they come in and they want to find your crown jewels. So they're going to enumerate your file shares. They're going to try and guess passwords. And by identifying that sequence of events, we were able to alert the customer that there was a ransomware threat that was in progress. And it allowed them to contain the threat to just that Atlanta location rather than having it spread enterprise-wide. Unfortunately, we weren't deployed in Atlanta, so we couldn't help them earlier. But it allowed them to really keep frankly, the amount of Bitcoin that they would have to be thinking about to a very, very minimal amount because they were able to contain that threat. And that's really the trick with ransomware, right? It's not just detecting ransomware, because frankly, you can detect ransomware without a security tool, right? You'll get a ransom note, or you'll get all of your data encrypted. So the trick is really detecting it as early as possible in the life cycle. So clearly, what that case study was meant to illustrate, and really what the problem statements that I talked about and John talked about, the network does offer a tremendous vantage point, right? But network security has become cumbersome, right? You've added layer over layer over layer, and this is part of the reason, network folks and security folks sometimes don't see eye to eye, right? Because, as security folks, a lot of times we want that additional visibility, that additional telemetry. We want to put in more tools. But the network folks look at all of those layers and say, look, these are all potential points of failure. Why can't the security just be built into the network itself? And that's really what Arista's focus is, right? To move from this notion of network security to networks that are just secure by default. Our CEO, Jayshree Lal, loves to say, look, we need to convert security from being a noun to being an adjective, right? And if you're grammatically challenged like I am, I have to think about that for a second. But the idea being, let's stop making security something that is a layered and layered and layered approach and make it something that's just built in and it's an attribute of the underlying network. So how can you do that? You start by really thinking about basic hygiene, right? Do you have your system set up in a way that systems that shouldn't talk to each other don't talk to each other? Do you have your enforcement and your perimeter rules and firewall rules and proxy rules, etc., set up correctly? The next thing is you need to analyze the traffic, but before you analyze it, you have to be able to collect it and collect it in a seamless way, in a way that scales across large networks, across even terabit per second type networks. And that's why the network packet brokers come in, right? This is a tremendous category of technologies out there that allow you to get data from where it is to where you need it to be, whether it's for network performance analysis or whether it is for security analysis. And then finally, you've got the security tool sets that sit on top of that perform that network visibility, that perform the threat hunting, whether it's automated or manual, that provides things like incident response and forensics capabilities. And there's a whole bunch of categories there as well. So at Arista, we've got solutions that cover that entire gamut, right? And feedback that information back into the hygiene portions of this platform. So on the core network side, obviously Arista is really well known for our switching and our routing fabrics and the ability to do that in a highly reliable way, right? Without having to deal with the bugs and things of that nature that you often find in some of the competitive equipment out there. But everything that is on the right-hand side of the slide, whether it's the packet brokers or the NDR solution, are also completely network infrastructure agnostic. Right? They just speak TCP/IP, and if that happens to be a network that is not Arista, that works just fine. For the packet broker portion of this, we have a great solution in our DMF toolset, which is the DANS monitoring fabric. We won't go into super detail about this solution today, but it essentially solves that problem that I was talking about earlier, which is how do I get packets from the source of where I'm picking them off the wire to all of the different tool sets that need to analyze those packets or need to analyze those flows? How do I draw inferences? How do I get things like proof of innocence when I'm on the network, right? How do I identify bottlenecks in the network and then proactively deal with them rather than this becoming a customer experience issue as a network operator? And then finally, we've got the NDR solution, which we'll actually talk about in a lot more detail today. And that solution and our solutions around that focus a lot on obviously network detection and response, but also supporting use cases like incident response and network forensics and just network traffic analysis, so that customers like yourselves can focus less on the data collection and focus more on the risk management decisions, right? So the data is presented to them, it's contextualized, so that as a customer, you're looking at that and saying, okay, you know what, this is my CFO's computer. I need to take some action if my CFO's computer is compromised. On the other hand, this is the computer that displays the menu in the cafeteria every morning, maybe a slightly lesser of a threat to my environment. So let's jump a little bit deeper into the NDR platform. So as you might expect, the solution really has two key components, right? So we've got the sensors and the nucleus. The sensors sit right behind the DMF or the network packet broker solution that we talked about. They can also sit in the cloud. They can sit on your VMware infrastructure. And actually, most recently, we've announced the ability to deploy these within the Arista campus switches as well. So if you've got Arista campus switches, you don't have to actually deploy any additional NDR hardware. You can leverage those switches as sensors, and that obviously has tremendous operational benefits, right? Just the elimination of all of that hardware footprint, the requirements for rack space and power and things like that, all gone because you're leveraging the underlying switching fabric. And then secondly, from a security perspective, because you're that close to the edge of the network on the inside edge, you get visibility that you can never really get from a sensor that may be 1 or 2 hops away. But we do support a variety of form factors. We can certainly use the switches, but we can be standalone sensors that hook into, again, any span port, any tap infrastructure that you might have. The sensors collect the data. They can store it from a full packet capture perspective, but they extract about 3 to 5% of that data and they send it over to the nucleus. And the nucleus does the 3 things that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. Firstly, gather an understanding of what's on the network, right? This goes back to that first problem we talked about. What's on the network? What's it doing? How is it behaving, etc. And we use a variety of AI-based fingerprinting technologies here to allow us to track devices as they move along. The second step is then analyzing that data to be able to detect threats, understand the full scope of a threat, including these non-malware and insider threats where someone might be leveraging existing accounts or existing privileges. And then finally to hunt, right? So the ability to not just stop at a threat and say, what else is happening on the network? How can I connect the dots so that, again, as the analyst, you're not left with the onus to paint that more complete picture, but you focus on, okay, I know what device is impacted, I know what other devices have tried to connect to, and I know what I need to do next, right? Whether it is escalating this to your C-suite, whether this is launching an investigation or an incident, whether it's engaging outside counsel or an incident response team, things of that nature. So let's dive one level deeper. What's behind the scenes? I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard the word AI and ML at least a few times today already. We've all been playing around with GPT-3 and the tools like that. So let me give you a little bit of a behind the scenes view of that AI, right? So it starts with the data. We fundamentally believe that your AI is only as good as the quality of your data. And for that reason, we start with the full packet, right? But the first thing we do is we convert those packets into people, devices, applications, things of that nature. So you can see here a screenshot from the product, right? So this device has had, good 12, 15 IP addresses over the course of time, but it's still the same device. Look, DHCP is cheap. IP addresses change all the time. You could be coming in over Wi-Fi right now. 20 minutes later, you're at your desk, hardwired. Tomorrow, you're working from home, coming in over the VPN. The platform recognizes it's the same device. And that's fundamental because then you can start to build profiles for that device and you can attribute behaviors back to that device, right? So rather than moving along with an IP address, which might be a Mac device right now, but could be an iPhone or a Windows device 10 minutes from now with completely different behaviors. So instead of doing that, we focus on the device, on the user, on the application, and attribute behaviors back to that. What it also allows us to do is to start to cluster things that look similar. So we can say, hey, these are all of your thermostats. These are all of your domain controllers. These are all of your vulnerability scanners. Now that has a couple of advantages, right? One is it allows you to see how these things are clustering in your environment, but it also allows you to spot outliers because you can see that there's one thermostat that seems to be uploading data in large quantities once a day. Why is it doing that? Right? So it allows the platform and your analysts to ask that deeper question by surfacing things that are interesting. Right? So here's an example, for instance, of a IoT device that we found in one of our customer environments that was uploading data once a day and uploading it to a pretty interesting location, right? So a location that was not typical for this environment. It was, as you can see from the description of the network, it was an autonomous system network based in Malaysia. And this is a company that doesn't do work anywhere close to Malaysia. So, it triggered that question. And as it turned out, this was actually a keystroke logger that someone had plugged into one of their devices. It was record keystrokes and then upload them to this external location. But like I said, we don't want to stop at just telling you there's that one problem. We want to paint a more complete picture, right? And this is really where our AVA technology comes in, which allows you to go into the environment and see that more complete picture, right? So for instance, when we see that upload that was happening, AVA would go out and say, okay, what do we know about this domain? What do we know about this ASN? What do we know about this IP address? Are there other devices on the network that are communicating to that same device? Are there other devices on the network that maybe are communicating to the same domain or even a different domain that shares the same hosting or the same underlying registration patterns, right? So it does that passive DNS analysis for you. It does that who is analysis for you. It'll even look up open source intelligence. It'll look up Aristotle. It'll do a internet search for that domain, try and figure out the reputation. And I'll hit a lot of this when we get into the demo as well. But the goal really, again, is to act as a decision support system, right? I always tell customers, like, look, if you went and hired a bunch of data analysts or data scientists, you don't welcome them the first day at work and say, here's Excel, good luck, right? Excel's a great tool, but Excel's not the type of tool you want to give your data scientists. You want to give them something that's a lot more sophisticated, that crunches the data, but allows them to then do the analysis, right? So you might give them something like Tableau, which allows them to kind of draw inferences, make those decisions based on data that has already been analyzed for them. And that's what we're trying to be at Arista NDR for the security operators over here. And like I said, perspective is everything, right? You look at this picture, you see, a couple of cute cats, right? But you zoom out a little bit, and there's something more to it. And that's really the point of looking at the full network packet. You look at NetFlow, and you see, your typical 5-tuple type of information, right? But that same packet, if you look at it more broadly, can show you the SMB headers. And the SMB headers allow you to see that file shares are being enumerated in your network. Passwords are trying to be guessed on your network. It allows you to spot that ransomware very early in the life cycle, if you will. And so that context is really why we focus on understanding that more complete picture. I also wanted to talk about how we match up the technology with our services as well. Right? So we have a team of experts that have come from places like the Big Four, like the FireEye Mandiants of the world, like the government and things of that nature. We've got folks, for instance, that were running the SOC for the Customs and Border Patrol. And these are folks that have responded to some of the most consequential breaches on the planet, right? Talk about, the Sony breach, talk about the Saudi Aramco breach, the Bank of Bangladesh breach. We've all been engaged in some of these large breaches, and we've taken that knowledge and built it into a variety of services, starting with kind of a more managed NDR, but also things like our incident response services and our proactive assessments. And this is where we work closely with the likes of TWE, right? Partnering with them, partnering with their customers to make sure we combined offering can deliver value to that end customer. So my last slide before I jump into the demo here is really just a recap of some of the use cases that customers adopt Arista NDR technology for, right? The most basic, of course, is detection and response. It's in the name, NDR. A lot of times it's things like ransomware early warning. It's IoT threats, unmanaged device threats, contractors, things of that nature, supply chain type threats as well. Insider risk is certainly becoming a more and more important part of the discussion. And this is not because we don't trust our colleagues, right? We certainly don't trust them from a technology perspective, but also these days, almost every threat manifests as an insider threat, right? Because what the outside attacker does is he or she tries to compromise an account on the inside. And once they have that account, they're practically an insider. So that focus on insider threats is really important as well. In the cloud, like I mentioned, we can deploy our sensors and our nucleus in the cloud, and you can do workload protection. You can do network analysis of your cloud traffic. Who's communicating with your workloads? What are those workloads doing, etc. Are people using unauthorized, things like Dropbox or Google Drive when your corporate solution is Box.com, right? Figuring all of that kind of stuff out is also something that we help with. And then finally, the ability to consolidate a variety of tools, right? Whether it's NDR with things like threat hunting and digital forensics and network forensics all in a single platform. Obviously, consolidation is the name of the game, and especially given the economic climate we're all in. Customers want to see more value out of a single solution, and that's something that Arista is well equipped to provide. So let me switch to the demo real quick. So let me stop sharing this screen.
Yeah, Rudy, one thing I want to make sure everybody in the audience knows too is that if they do have any questions about what they've seen so far or about the demo that you're about to show, please don't hesitate to throw those right into the webinar questions section. We have people to answer those live, and also if we have time at the end, we'll talk about those here on the webinar. So just want to make sure that people knew that we had that functionality before you got started with this awesome interface.
Yeah, no, John, thanks for that. And yeah, we'd love to have questions. I mean, we've actually planned time for questions, so don't leave me hanging.
Yeah, don't hesitate, anyone.
So hopefully you guys can see my screen.
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Let me just get this GoToMeeting window out of the way. All right, so this is the main dashboard, or one of the main dashboards, I should say, when you log into the platform. And look, there's, as dashboards go, you can customize this, you can, there's widgets you can add and remove and so on. I wanted to focus on a couple of different things, right? One was that visibility question. What is actually on my network? And I'll actually bring up a little pivot table here so that you can see this, right? So here's what is on my little demo test network. You can see there's a bunch of different types of devices. Let me just sort it by device type, and you can see the types of devices, right? Android devices, Apple devices, whether it's regular Apple, iOS devices, etc. And one of the things the platform's automatically done for me is it's actually detected if these are managed or not. So it detects whether these devices have an EDR solution or these devices have some kind of SCCM type solution. And so it's one way to kind of slice and dice the data within the platform. And if I click on any of this, it'll give me a list of those devices, right? So that's one quick view into that visibility. The other view of visibility is really at the application level. And here's where you can see, for instance, I've asked it to tell me if there's any instant messaging being used on my network, or any thin clients like remote desktop protocol or TeamViewer, things like that, webmail being used, any tunneling happening on my network. All of these tend to be vectors for ransomware to get into my network. And so it allows me as an analyst to see, is it me or is, sorry, it looks like my browser starting to flicker. Let me try and kill.
It looks okay over here, just so you know.
Okay. All right. Every time I clicked, it was going up somewhere else. So anyways, we're back now. So application visibility is another key aspect when you're defending a network, right? Because the ability to know that someone is using remote desktop on your protocol when you've standardized, let's say, on Citrix, that's interesting. Why is that happening? Who's doing it? Where are they coming in from? So that's another aspect of that visibility I wanted to stress. I'll pivot now into this bottom section, right? So this is what we call situations. This is that complete picture that, telling you not just here's one alert, but what else is happening on the network. And we'll look at an example of that right now. So if I look at my high risk situations, it looks like there's about 5 or 6 that I need to deal with as a security analyst. I'm going to jump into this one because it says phishing. And phishing is always something that, can lead to a lot more things on the network, right? So here's what the platform has constructed for me, right? So it's built a narrative of what's happened on the network. On the left, you can see a timeline. So for those of you who are forensicators or think about building timelines of activities, well, here's one that's built for you automatically, right? And in many cases, we've been able to identify the type of activity. In this case, whether it's exfiltration, things of that nature. And you can see that there's multiple devices involved, right? And you, even on the right here, where we've drawn a storyboard of this, right away you can see there's a couple of Windows devices that are involved, maybe more. We'll get into this a little bit. There's a Linux device, etc. And you'll also notice that these devices are actually labeled, right? And we'll look at that device in more detail. I wanted to look at the domain real quick though first. So this domain is one of the domains that was identified as a suspected command and control source. Couple of things to point out here, right? Firstly, you'll notice that this domain is appspot.com. Appspot.com is a Google cloud hosting platform. So again, the reputation for appspot.com is stellar, right? So if you went up and looked up appspot.com, it's not going to tell you that this is a malicious website. But of course, when you have cloud hosted services like that, attackers can leverage those as a way to host their badness, if you will, in a way that does not trigger your proxies or does not trigger your firewall rule sets. Maybe does not even trigger anything that's running on the endpoint that's looking for bad domains, because this is not a bad domain, right? So what we've done on the NDR side is we've actually gone in and analyzed this. And you can read the analysis here that says, look, the analysis shows that no data has been uploaded to this. So we're labeling this as command and control as opposed to data exfiltration. And you can jump into the domain details and see who else is accessing it, etc. In fact, if I pivot over here, you can see that there's multiple devices that have actually touched this particular domain. So very much like what I was talking about, right? That decision support system, rather than you having to go figure out, okay, who else talked to this domain or what other devices on my network should I be concerned about, the picture is painted for you. Let me go back to that K Valdez view, because it seems like K Valdez is my patient zero. Right? This is what started this whole situation or this whole incident in my environment. And if I click on this particular device, it gives me a little bit more detail, but I'm going to actually jump in and ask it for even more detail. So what you see in front of you now is a profile for that device. And to be clear, this profile has been built purely through network introspection. Right? So we've not hooked into your Active Directory. We're not asking you for a data feed from your SCCM or things of that nature. As one customer loved to say to me, it's like, look, if I already had this information in my Active Directory or in my SCCM, I probably wouldn't need you, right? So a lot of times, this is that other 50% of devices that fall into that unmanaged bucket, if you will. You can see that this profile has been built. This device is running Windows 7. It's been on the network for a fair amount of time. It also, if it had multiple IP addresses, we would track that. It's had multiple usernames. It looks like K Valdez is the primary username, but there's also an administrator, a local administrator, presumably, that's been used. We've identified 8 network applications that are running on this device, etc. And as I mentioned, we've actually identified that it's running Sentinel-1. And in this case, because we actually integrate with Sentinel-1, you can see that we've actually called the API there and allow you directly to pivot either into Sentinel-1, and I won't log in here. We'll leave the Sentinel-1 demos to Sentinel-1, but we work with all of the major endpoint vendors. But you can also, right from here, disable this device from the network, right? So if you're sitting in the security operations center and you say, look, this K Valdez device is clearly up to no good, I want to isolate it from the network. I want to trigger my containment policies, whether it's through Sentinel-1 or through your network perimeter devices, etc. This is kind of the area that you would do that from, simply by saying disable networking from here. And then if you scroll down to the bottom, you can actually see the traffic profile, right? What has this device been up to on the network? Lots of LDAP, it looks like, lots of TLS. But then if you go further down, it's actually using a number of other protocols as well. And all of these have statistical analysis performed on them, right? So in this particular case, it looks like 43% of the network activity associated with this device, this K Valdez sys3099-W7, was actually LDAP. On the right, we can see a couple of different things, right? I'll start with this fingerprints tab. So this is the way we track that device, right? How do we know it's K Valdez, even though it's had multiple IP addresses and things of that nature? We build that digital fingerprint for it. We build a network fingerprint, and we track that fingerprint. And you can see the types of parameters, right? There's 68 parameters here. I'm not going to click on every one of them, but you can see it's types of things like what the device name is presented to Kerberos, what TLS ciphers this device is using, what HTTP user agents it's using. So it's things that you can draw from the network, including obscure things like how is it using the NetBIOS protocol or DCRPC. In this case, it looks like it's calling this DCRPC function with the opnum 77, and it's one of 9 devices performing this. But this device represents more than a quarter of those connections, right? So you can see the analysis that goes into tracking this device and tracking it over time. In this case, for over a year, irrespective of IP address changes. And on this first tab, you can actually see the threats. So if I click on one of these, it dives into the detail, into our workbench that shows you, okay, why is this a threat, right? What's the actual sequence of bits and bytes that went over the wire that triggered this particular behavior? If I click on this, you'll see on the right, all of the extracted activity information, right? Things like the user agent, things like the header information, things like the actual body size, body information as well. Now, I want to point out, because this comes up a lot, encryption, right? How do we think about encryption? We don't really, if data is unencrypted, we'll certainly analyze it. But if it's not, we'll look at the header information. We'll look at the TLS handshake. We'll look at things like that as well to do that. One thing I wanted to point out as well is you can actually export this data to PCAP. So if you've got to save this, let's say in an evidence store, or as part of a forensic case that you're conducting against maybe an insider or an employee that is disgruntled, you have the ability to grab that evidence from it. And then you can also look at it in much more detail within the platform as well, where you can actually go and look at the captured data in the platform, see the sequence of zeros and ones that went over the wire. So at this point, it goes out, pulls it out from the sensor and presents it to you. You can see in this case that it looks like it was a zipped file that was moved over the wire. So a couple of other things I want to show you. Let me go back to the workbench and I'll clear this search and run the search again. So now what we're getting is kind of an empty, what we call an empty query, right? So an empty query is essentially everything, and looks like that didn't run. Let me run it again. This is now telling me everything that's on my network, right? So all of the devices, I can see all of the domains, all of the network activities by clicking on any of these tabs. But I'll stay focused on the devices here. And I want to show you a use case here that is fairly common in a security team, right? You get some threat intelligence, let's say, from maybe one of your peers at another company, or maybe it's from the FBI or your local information security sharing center, these ISACs as they're called, right? Depending on what vertical you're in. So the financial services have the FS ISAC, media and entertainment have their own ISAC, legal has their own ISAC, so on and so forth. So you get some intelligence and it tells you, look, there's a new threat that we're really concerned about. It's targeting Windows devices. So one of the things you can come in here is you can go in and you can look for Windows devices. Now, many different ways to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this capability that we call feature summaries. Think about feature summaries as faceted search. If you've ever shopped at Amazon.com, and unfortunately for all of us, which of us hasn't, the ability to filter and say, yeah, I'm looking for a nail gun, but I'm looking for a nail gun that is battery operated. Let's say, right? The ability to kind of filter down. So in this case, I'm looking for Windows devices. So I'm going to go into my device type section. And we find a number of device types. Again, the threat intelligence said this is primarily a Windows threat. So let me filter for Windows devices. And I'm going to say add to query. And you'll notice, right over here at the top, that's gotten added to our query bar, right? So what essentially you're doing here, without necessarily realizing it, is you're actually building a model. And as you can tell, I'm certainly no data scientist, and most companies don't have a ton of data scientists. You're still able to build a model because the platform has built an ability for you to take the data that you have and slice and dice it in a variety of ways, and then run that data analysis on it. So let's not stop here. Windows devices is interesting, but the threat intel maybe also told you that it's using a particular domain, called foo.com. Now you could go in and you could add and say, okay, show me all of the devices that are Windows devices that went to foo.com, right? I have a domain name section here that I can choose. But that doesn't sound very robust, right? Because attackers use and change domains all the time. So rather than looking for a domain name, let me be a little bit more innovative. Let me look for maybe the way that domain was registered, right? So I'm going to do a search for a registrar here. And I'll say, find me all of the Windows devices that connecting out to an external domain that uses, let's say, Gandhi SAS registrar. Why am I picking this? Maybe the intel told me it is foo.com. I went and looked up foo.com, either in our system or in the threat intel system, and it told me, look, foo.com is registered with Gandhi SAS. And so I want to get a little bit smarter about this threat, and rather than looking specifically for foo.com, I'm going to look for all domains that belong to this this particular registrar, or were registered with this particular registrar. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll actually add something that is very network or NetFlow oriented, right? So let me look for, let's say, a source port, let's say TCP source port, and maybe this threat uses high number TCP source ports greater than 1,000. So I'll run that search in a second, but I want to point out a few things in this model, right? So you'll notice we've got 3 different things that we've added, and they're somewhat orthogonal to each other. I'll start with the most basic, the TCP source port. You can see that in NetFlow, you can see that on the wire. The second one is who is data. It's threat intelligence data. It never shows up on the wire, right? You've got to pull this from an orthogonal source and cross-analyze it with the domains. Because remember, we're not even factoring the domain in this query at all or in this model at all. And then finally, the fact that this is a Windows device, again, something that has to be inferred from the network, but it's not, every device doesn't say, hey, I'm a Windows device, right? You've got to infer that from the network. So we've taken these three orthogonal axes, if you will, and combined them into one model. Let me go ahead and run that. And when I run it, you'll see that it comes back with two devices that have shared this pattern of behavior on the network. And you've taken some threat intelligence that we got from, again, from the FBI, from a buddy down the street, and we've built a model that allows us to say, this is what we're concerned about. So in this case, the Sam Petrov device, the Jay Gouveia device. We now know what matches, but I can go one step further. I can actually save this as a model so that the hunt would automatically be done for me. So let me just call this TWE webinar hunt. I'll save it as a model, and let's say I'll save it for the next day, right? Because this is very short-term intelligence that I'm concerned about. I go ahead and save that, and what that would do is it'll actually make this a model in the system, and the system will automatically hunt for this on my behalf. So I don't have to come back here every hour or every 30 minutes or every day or every week to see are there other devices besides N Petrov and Jay Gouveia that maybe I've already gone ahead and remediated, if you will. So that was a quick snapshot of the product, right? There's a lot more stuff that I can show you. I'll actually pivot really quickly to Splunk. If you're using tools like Splunk or QRadar, tools of that nature, we can feed all of the alerts that we get into a tool like Splunk or into a tool like QRadar or ArcSight or what have you. We support also syslog, Ceph, things of that nature. But what's interesting is you also have the ability to pivot from those tools into our tool, right? So for instance, if you're dealing with a Splunk alert that looks somewhat like this, right? A bunch of, frankly, gobbledygook, right? That you've got to now parse and say, okay, what is 192.168.86.56? Is this something that I care about? Instead, you can just do a pivot. And what the platform will do is it'll take you into our platform, and it looks like I'm having internet issues there, but it'll take you and drop you in the device itself to show you what that device is and what it's done on the network. Similar to that device profile that I showed you earlier for K-Valdez. It looks like my internet connection might be having issues. So let me just refresh and go back to devices. And this is the kind of profile that you would get, telling you what threats are involved in this, what the fingerprint is, things of that nature. So let me kind of stop there. I know I've been talking for a little bit. Any questions? And I know we've been tracking questions on the chat. So maybe John, I'll turn it over to you. Any questions in the audience that you'd like me to address?
Yeah, we've got a few. There a couple of them are, I guess, pretty obvious, and I hope you didn't cover these, but I think maybe to just put a specific focus on them will be helpful. The first one, I'm just going to do these out of order. How do you scope an NDR solution, and how do you scale it? I think everybody who would be listening on the call needs to know, what's the level of effort here, right, to use a solution like this?
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question, because frankly, it's been kind of the bane of network technologies, right? Like, how many sensors do I need to deploy? Do I need to put them on every network segment? Things of that nature. So a couple of different parts to that answer. Firstly, the ability to integrate this into the switching fabric is huge, right? Because you've got switches deployed everywhere. Why not leverage them as sensors? No additional hardware deployed. So it allows you to get broad visibility across your network without needing to deploy all of this additional hardware. The second aspect that I'll touch on is we've tried to be really smart about our network analysis, right? So for instance, let's say you want to monitor lateral movement, right? So traffic going between a device in your New York City office on that LAN segment. Now, historically, from a network monitoring perspective, you'd have to actually be on that segment to monitor it, right? You'd have to be on a span port of that switch looking at it. Now, I'm sure everyone on this call is thinking about that and saying, wait a second, are you telling me you have to put me on every network segment? Well, this is where we've tried to be smart, right? So for instance, with a lot of our customers, we're not sitting on every single network segment. Instead, we'll sit, let's say, in the data center, sitting right in front of your LDAP infrastructure or in front of your domain controller. Now what happens is when device A in the New York City office is trying to communicate to device B, well, what does it have to do? It first has to request a Kerberos ticket or an LDAP authentication ticket from that LDAP controller or your domain controller that is sitting in the data center. When that traffic hits the domain controller, we're sitting there analyzing that Kerberos packet, that LDAP packet, that SMB packet, and we now know that device A is trying to communicate with device B, or that device A has made 50 failed login attempts to 75 devices on the network in the last 60 seconds. So the ability to analyze that when you're sitting far off from that local network is really key to being able to scale the solution without having to drop sensors all over the place. So there's a couple of different ways that we can deal with that problem, John. Hopefully that gives folks an idea for how we approach it, because it has been challenging in the past for other network solutions.
Yeah, I think the fact that you guys also offer a managed offering as well, I think we're seeing that people get good results out of both ways, but obviously it comes down to whether or not you want to invest time and energy and people into doing it or having you guys do it. And then there's the technical stuff that you just talked about in terms of what it takes. But I think that for people that need a solution like this, and I think that number is growing a lot, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, that it's not going to be so sophisticated. It's more just about sort of planning it out. And also, I like the intelligence of, not necessarily having to build this massive sub infrastructure or something like that. There's a lot of clever ways you can capture the core data or the key data that you want. So that's very helpful. We do have a couple other quick questions, and then we'll leave some time at the end for people to fill out that survey. But I think these are actually pretty important. One kind of plays right off of that last question, which is, all right, so you're monitoring all this traffic. Well, one of the big problems that everybody's had in the past is encrypted traffic. And so in the case of Awake, how do you guys how do you monitor encrypted traffic? Because it's invisible to so many systems. And so there's just threats lurking everywhere. Maybe you can just run through kind of what the approach is there.
Sure, yeah, look, this could be an entire webinar in itself, right? But let me give you the high level. Just a couple of stats, because I completely connect with what the question, or the person who asked the question. From a north-south perspective, across our deployments, somewhere around 90, maybe even as high as 95% of the traffic is encrypted. And of course, TLS being a massive chunk of that, right? From an east-west perspective, I'd say that number is probably closer to maybe 2/3, so 60, 65%. So you're spot on that more and more data is getting encrypted. The other aspect, which may be implied in that question, is, of course, attackers are using encryption too, right? They're leveraging point-to-point encryption that, frankly, you can't decrypt, you can't man in the middle that kind of traffic, right? So instead, our approach has really been to leverage the underlying protocols themselves. So how can we get smarter about encryption, right? So right here, in fact, you can see, for instance, one of the things we have is the TLS ciphers. So the way TLS connections are created and how the ciphers are used is actually very useful information for us to not only track a device as being done in this case, but actually identify the application, right? So for instance, the way a browser connects to the internet is very different than the way PowerShell connects to the internet. Now, why is that important? Because if you see PowerShell connecting to Twitter, you're probably going to be quite concerned, as opposed to a browser connecting to Twitter, right? Or if you see an IoT device connecting to Twitter, believe it or not, right? We've seen IoT devices compromised, and the attacker used Twitter as a command and control channel. Now, you might ask, why Twitter? Well, because Twitter is something that you're not going to just block, right? It's a fairly common website. I'm sure many of your users use it, etc. So the important thing is not to identify every Twitter connection, but is to identify when PowerShell is being used to connect to Twitter, or when IoT devices are used to connect to Twitter. So that's one of the aspects of using encrypted analysis, right, or using encrypted traffic analysis. Another example I'll give you of this is a protocol like GoToMeeting, right, or an application like GoToMeeting. Now, in this GoToMeeting, we're sharing screens. I could easily click on the give keyboard and mouse to you, John, and you'd have remote keyboard and be able to control my desktop just like you were doing your own. Now, those traffic patterns show up differently. So when there's just a voice-only call versus when they're screen sharing, versus when we're using the chat, versus when you're using remote keyboard, versus when I'm uploading a file. All of that, even without decrypting it, using data science, using machine learning, using supervised learning specifically, you can classify those different areas and say, you know what, this looks like remote keyboard, this looks like a voice call, this looks like file sharing. And that, along with other contexts, right? So for instance, if my device is also showing, some beaconing out behavior, it is also showing a bunch of failed login attempts on the local network, and it shows that GoToMeeting was used for remote keyboard, I now have the ability to complete that picture and say, yes, this looks like a pretty comprehensive threat in the environment. So that's another example of using the encrypted data analysis, right? And it doesn't rely on decrypting the data, it doesn't rely on looking at the payload, because frankly, as again the questioner said, right, the traditional network security methods of looking for specific sequence of zeros and ones on the wire just don't work in an encrypted world. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of color and some examples of how we deal with encrypted traffic.
It does, and even the solutions that can decrypt traffic, it takes a lot of firepower, a lot of chips, if you will, to do it, plus a lot of setup and management, and there's always trouble with it. So
I think all the privacy challenges.
coming at it from a different direction, I think is really valuable. All right, last one. Hopefully we can do this in 2 minutes so people have enough time to do the survey. This is from media customer. Basically, they want to know if you have any examples of threats sort of in like the media landscape, like content theft or something, and how you guys could deal with that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We've got a number of customers in the media and entertainment business, and I happen to be talking to the CISO of, let's just call it one of the top 3 media and entertainment companies on the planet.
I think I know who you're talking about.
I was asking this customer, like, hey, what keeps you up at night, right? And we made the usual jokes about too much work and kids and so on and so forth. And he said, like, look, ransomware is something we think we have a good handle over. So the thing that really worries us, because this affects the core of our business, is actually the content theft, right? Everyone's heard the stories about episodes being leaked, things of that nature. A lot of times it could be contractors, it could be insiders, but he said increasingly they're seeing external attackers targeting their systems because these things can actually get a lot of money for the attacker, right? They're also concerned a lot about geopolitical threats. For better or worse, I guess mostly for the worse, we live in a highly polarized environment these days, right? And media and entertainment companies, specifically ones that have news businesses to them, have targets on their back because they're perceived to be, one way or the other, left or right or what have you. And so they're very concerned about someone being able to not hack the camera necessarily, but hack the IP feed from the camera that actually then gets broadcast. And these days, a lot of that is happening over TCP/IP, right? So that someone could inject fake news into it. I mean, everyone probably heard about the Associated Press hack from a few years ago, where in that case, their Twitter account was hacked, and they put the attackers put out a tweet saying the White House had been bombed, and that led to massive crash on Wall Street and things like that. Of course, the White House hadn't been bombed. It was, quote unquote, fake news, but it came out looking like it was the Associated Press saying it obviously had great reputation, and it altered the reputation of this news company, right? So that's something that these companies are really concerned about, and we see these threats every day, targeting these organizations.
Well, I think that's really, really helpful, and we have seen that it's really impactful there. And they looked at you guys versus the other available solutions in the marketplace, and you've been the clear winner. I think it's very, very comfortable to call you guys the leader in this space, and I think everybody who's looking in this area should be checking you guys out. I think this video will serve as a good intro to people. So for everybody who saw it today, your colleagues can get this as a follow-up video. So we'll be sending that link out to you. And I'm sure we'll be using it for other people who want to get the intro as well. So Rudy, I can't thank you enough for presenting today.
I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone in the audience. And John, thanks for hosting.